While kings pursued gold and glory, she built an empire of bones. Her name isn't listed among the great conquerors of the world, but among those who destroyed the most without ever leaving the throne. And to this day, in Madagascar, no one dares speak her name aloud at night. For 33 years, one woman ruled with an iron fist and a poisoned soul. Her name? Ranavalona I. She didn't need wars against foreign enemies. She exterminated her own. She severed her nation at the root. She persecuted, tortured, and reinvented pain as a political tool. Half the population vanished. The rest learned to survive in silence. If you enjoy true stories that challenge what history books tell you, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I always read them. Before becoming the most feared figure in Madagascar's history, she was just Ramavo, the daughter of a modest officer in the kingdom. No royal blood, no claim to the throne, no prestige. Her fate seemed confined to the shadows of the court, far from any crown. But fate, when it meets ambition, can twist into something dark. Everything changed when her father uncovered and reported a conspiracy against the king. As a reward, the family was brought inside the royal walls, and there, amid whispers and alliances, young Ramavo learned a lesson she would carry for life. Survival depends on the right loyalty, and silence at the right time. In time, the king decided to use her as a political pawn, and gave her in marriage to his son, Ranavalona I. For her, it was a step forward. For him, just another wife among many. The prince had several spouses and barely hid his preference for others. Ramavo was ignored and silently observant. While the court celebrated with banquets and foreign alliances, she listened. When missionaries came preaching a new god, she watched. What grew inside her wasn't just rejection, it was a cold rage, fed day by day through humiliation. She saw her relatives punished unjustly, friends executed, sacred customs mocked by outsiders. And silently, she began to plot. She had no charm, no popular support. What she had was calculation, a steady gaze, and a rare skill, forging bonds with those who truly held power, the generals, the healers, the ancestral spirits. While the other wives sought the king's favor, Ramavo sought the favor of those who held spears and ancient secrets. She wasn't born to rule, but something in her refused to be irrelevant. At every silent feast, in every ceremony that left her sidelined, something grew inside her. It wasn't vanity, it was bitter conviction. The conviction that one day she would no longer be ignored, she would be feared. The world around her laughed at her forgotten position. But no one noticed what was taking shape, not a queen, but a force disguised as a woman, ready to destroy everything that had scorned her. And then, the moment arrived. Ranavalona I fell ill, weak, isolated, surrounded by courtiers who pretended to believe in his recovery, but were already whispering names of successors. The throne began to shake, and among all the anxious eyes of the kingdom, only one pair remained calm, Ramavo's. The official heir was the king's nephew. Young, educated, respected by lineage, but no bloodline could rival the silent strategy she had been building for years. Even before his death was announced, she acted. While others wept, she advanced. She summoned soldiers from the highlands, where her word still carried weight. Ordered blockades, intercepted messengers, occupied the palace with armed men loyal only to her. When the people of Antananarivo awoke, the capital was already seized. And in the main hall, she wasn't mourning her husband's death. She was smiling at the empty throne. There was no traditional coronation, no acclamation from the people. There was imposition. "The queen lives," the soldiers said, "and whoever does not acknowledge it dies with the past." The nephew's allies were beheaded without trial. Clan leaders were forced to kneel. Those who hesitated vanished. They say bodies lay piled behind the palace for days, a warning that a new era had begun, and there would be no mercy. The woman dismissed by the other wives now controlled the army, the temple, and the people's fear. She changed her name. She was no longer Ramavo. She became Ranavalona I, and with that made it clear she wasn't just a successor. She was the beginning of a new time, a time with no inheritance, no consensus, no room for doubt. The throne, once sacred, became an instrument of revenge. And Ranavalona didn't need a crown to be recognized. She needed only silence and corpses. Her reign had begun, and Madagascar began to bleed. But what came next wasn't just political repression. It was a war against anything that smelled foreign. Ranavalona didn't see the outside world as an opportunity. She saw it as a threat. And to her, preserving sovereignty meant amputating the country from the rest of the world. Her first public declaration wasn't about taxes or new laws. It was about faith. She ordered every imported religion to be wiped out. Christian schools were shut down. European missionaries received one order: leave immediately or die. But the persecution didn't stop with decrees. Ranavalona believed Christianity wasn't just a doctrine, it was a spiritual plague, and she vowed to rip it out by the root. The trials began. Those who hid Bibles, who prayed in silence, who showed sympathy toward foreigners, were dragged through the streets, exposed in public squares, and punished with brutality. Some were drowned, others thrown off cliffs. Many were burned alive, all in the name of a national purity that existed only in her tormented mind. She claimed that Madagascar was protected by the Sampi, ancestral talismans that blessed the land with spiritual strength. For those spirits to remain, the foreign gods had to be silenced. The ancient temples were reactivated, traditional priests returned to power, and any village harboring Christian converts was surrounded and punished. Forced conversions became common practice again, but those who refused paid with their bodies. They say a man was forced to bury his own daughter alive after she was caught praying quietly. Another had his arms torn off in a public square and was then paraded around as a trophy of loyalty to the Queen. It wasn't just religious cleansing, it was a warning. In Madagascar, there was room for only one spiritual power, and it had Ranavalona's face. And while the blood of converts ran down the village stones, the Queen grew stronger in her belief. The more isolated the island, the more sacred it would become. The world pulled away, and she smiled. But the isolation from foreigners was only the beginning. What Ranavalona truly wanted wasn't just political control. It was absolute control over the soul. And for that, she created a justice system built on superstition, terror, and sacrifice. Thus began the reign of the tangina, a poisonous seed used in ancient rituals, now turned into the primary weapon of the state. The procedure was simple and cruel. The accused, whether a farmer, officer, priest, or even a child, was given a mixture made from the tangina tree nut, ground and boiled. Alongside it, 3 small pieces of chicken skin. The test was clear. If the person vomited all 3 pieces, they were innocent. If not, they died in agony. And the most disturbing part, death wasn't seen as a failure. On the contrary, Ranavalona claimed that the ancestors themselves guided the outcome of the test. If someone died, it was because they deserved to. There were no appeals, no logic, only poison and blind faith. The practice spread with brutal speed. Each new day, hundreds of suspects were summoned. Petty accusations, like staring at the sky too long, carrying a strange symbol, or even sneezing during a ritual, were enough to begin the process. Entire families vanished. Between 5,000 and 10,000 people died each year, proving their innocence. And it wasn't only the living subjected to the ritual. Even corpses had to prove their innocence. The bodies obviously did not vomit, and that was enough for the state to declare them guilty and seize their family's property. People began to fear even their own words. Justice had become a lottery of suffering. Priests were trained to prepare the poison in public ceremonies. It became a spectacle, with chants, drums, and crowds watching. Death had turned into theatre. Ranavalona called it spiritual justice, but those who watched saw only ritualized slaughter. And as the poison killed, she came ever closer to what she desired most, a kingdom where no one dared to think before first feeling fear. And fear was only the beginning. Over time, Tangina was no longer enough. Ranavalona wanted more than discreet deaths. She wanted displays. She wanted fear to have a sound, a smell, applause, and example. That's when judgment stopped being about poison and became performance. Public executions became the new center of politics. There were no fixed times, no prior notice. At any moment, the palace bells could ring. And the people knew more blood would be spilled. Squares were prepared days in advance, makeshift altars, stakes driven into the ground, torches positioned. It wasn't justice, it was a show. And attendance was mandatory. Officials who had once served the crown were hung upside down. Priests who had converted to Christianity were tied up and forced to watch the execution of their own children before having their skin slowly removed. One afternoon, 14 believers were executed before a crowd. Their bodies left on display for 3 days. But it wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. Ranavalona used each execution as a statement. Each scream was an open letter to the outside world. Here, I rule, and those who won't accept it become dust. They said she liked to watch from a distance, sometimes from behind the curtains, sometimes from the highest balcony of the palace, but always with attention, like someone watching the harvest of their own planting. Once, a highly respected official beloved by the people was accused of treason. Instead of having him killed in silence, she ordered a special platform to be built just for him. She wanted everyone to see. She wanted everyone to cry. She wanted everyone to remember. The execution lasted nearly an hour, and when it was over, the silence that followed screamed louder than any plea. This was no longer a queen trying to consolidate power. She was a woman addicted to absolute control, feeding her dominion with collective dread. And the worst part, people no longer cried as much for the dead. They cried for the living, for those who might be called next. Executions became routine. The palace courtyard turned into a cemetery without crosses. And fear, once paralyzing, now guided every step. Madagascar no longer walked. It trembled, and it didn't tremble only before the Queen. It trembled because of what she had become, a distorted mirror of the nation itself. Ranavalona no longer fought just foreigners, religions, or traitors. Now her fury was aimed at her own people. Farmers, artisans, villagers, all were potential suspects. The Queen no longer demanded loyalty. She demanded blind obedience. And any gesture could be taken as insubordination. A prolonged look, a casual comment between neighbors, a charm hung on the wrong door. Punishment didn't wait for proof. It only needed a whisper. People began to disappear. Entire communities were accused of contact with suspicious clouds. Yes, clouds. Ranavalona believed that certain formations in the sky signaled witchcraft being cast against her. And if a village reported unusual clouds, all its residents were investigated. Those who couldn't explain a dream were condemned for spiritual conspiracy. Women who screamed during nightmares were burned alive for summoning hidden forces in their sleep. Men who spoke to themselves while working were branded messengers of foreign spirits. The Queen's madness became national doctrine. For many, the only way to escape was to strike first, report someone before being reported. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Parents turned in their children. Children learned that smiling at the wrong time could mean the end of the entire family. And if the victims died, the guilt was considered resolved. But if they resisted, or if there was no room left for more graves, there was an even crueler alternative: symbolic punishment. Ranavalona ordered that corpses be exhumed, tied to poles, and forced to stand, to show that not even the dead could escape royal punishment. The practice was so revolting that entire villages fell ill from the stench of decomposing bodies displayed at town entrances as sacred examples of failed obedience. Soldiers didn't clean the fields, they simply replaced the bodies when they fell. Fear no longer came just from death, it came from what death could no longer end. People began to walk with their eyes to the ground, not out of humility, but out of panic, because even the sky had become an enemy. And even surrounded by armies, talismans and priests, Ranavalona wasn't safe from what she feared most, betrayal within her own home. Her son, Prince Rakoto, was growing up watching his mother's brutality with eyes full of doubt. He was young, educated, fluent in French, an admirer of Enlightenment ideas, and increasingly repulsed by the violence that stained the palace halls. Rakoto was not weak, he was sensitive, and to Ranavalona that was almost worse than disloyalty. He intervened when he could, pleaded for mercy for prisoners, secretly cancelled executions, wrote covert letters to French ambassadors, seeking outside help to change the island's fate. He dreamed of a new Madagascar, but he was trapped at the heart of a tyranny. When the rumors reached the Queen's ears, there was no trial, there was mockery. She summoned her son to personally witness a public execution. From the palace balcony, she ordered the accused to be impaled slowly, and when she saw the prince turn his face away, she laughed aloud. A man who can't handle blood will never sit on this throne. From that moment, Rakoto was watched day and night. His servants were replaced by spies, his freedom within the palace was restricted, but his spirit remained defiant. That's when Joseph-François Lambert appeared, a French businessman who, under the guise of trade relations, proposed a plan to support Rakoto with resources, weapons, and political influence. In exchange for exclusive rights to Madagascar's natural wealth, the agreement was sealed in secret, known as the Lambert Charter. If it worked, Ranavalona would fall, the country would reopen its doors, and the era of terror would end. But someone spoke too much. The conspiracy was uncovered before it could be carried out, and the Queen's response came like an avalanche. All foreigners suspected were expelled or summarily executed. Soldiers stormed churches, schools, and consulates. Rakoto wasn't killed, perhaps due to a maternal instinct, perhaps for strategic reasons, but he was locked in an isolated section of the palace, watched constantly, forbidden from writing or leaving. The attempt at liberation had failed, and in place of hope, a new level of repression took hold. The Queen felt that even her own blood wanted to dethrone her, and with that, she learned one final lesson. When even your own child becomes the enemy, there's no one left to love, only bodies left to control. But for Ranavalona, it wasn't enough to dominate the people. She wanted to prove that no external power could even threaten her. And in 1849, she found the perfect opportunity. France, frustrated with the instability in Madagascar and the collapse of trade interests after the failed Lambert conspiracy, decided to act. Ships anchored off the coast with armed soldiers. The plan was simple: intimidate, occupy, restore diplomacy, or force the Queen's downfall. But they weren't dealing with an ordinary monarch. Ranavalona mobilized the local army with brutal speed. Men from the mountains, youths from the countryside, bitter old veterans, all were summoned. She promised not just victory, but vengeance against anyone who dared stain the land of the ancestors. The French attack was repelled with a fury that even the European generals hadn't expected. There was no truce, no negotiation. 21 French soldiers were captured. Then came the Queen's message. The prisoners' heads were cut off, impaled on stakes, and planted along the coast. It said their bodies were burned with aromatic woods, not out of respect, but so the perfumed smoke would carry the warning to the skies of Europe. She didn't just win, she humiliated, and she came out even more convinced of her own invincibility. From then on, her isolation became even more extreme. No foreigner would be received again without swearing loyalty to local traditions. No missionary would be tolerated, not even in secret. And any foreign approach would be treated as a declaration of war. For the people, it meant the end of any hope for external help. The island closed itself off like a tomb, and inside it, a delirious queen with a thirst for absolute control. But that triumph didn't bring her peace. On the contrary, the victory over France only fed her paranoia. If trained soldiers couldn't take her down, then the real enemies had to be elsewhere, in the villages, in people's thoughts, in her subjects' very dreams. Now fear came from every direction. The outside world had already been defeated. Now she turned her gaze inward and set out to destroy what little remained of her own people. Ranavalona had already defeated armies, silenced opponents, and even crushed her own son. But she still wanted more, total dominion, even over the tired bodies of those who had never dared to speak. It was in this atmosphere that the Fanampoana, the old system of service to the crown, turned into legalized slavery. Any man, woman, or child could be summoned at any moment to serve the state. There was no warning, no negotiation. All it took was a messenger knocking on the door and saying, "The Queen commands." Farmers were ripped from their fields to become soldiers, porters, laborers, or even living steps for nobles to walk on. Pregnant women gave birth along the way. The sick died from exhaustion. Families were separated for years, or forever. The Queen's projects demanded sweat, blood, and silence. She ordered paths to be opened through the forests, fortresses to be built on distant hills, stone roads to be laid with the people's bare hands. But the greatest symbol of her megalomania was the construction of her summer palace in the mountains, a monument that cost thousands of lives. More than 50,000 laborers were forced to carry massive stones for miles, without proper tools, without adequate food, without rest. Around 10,000 died in less than 2 years. A peasant's body was considered cheaper than a pair of oxen. And the most ironic part: once completed, Ranavalona visited the palace only 3 times. She complained about the weather, said the air was heavy, and never returned. They say she used to repeat, "Stone and lime last longer when mixed with blood." Meanwhile, villages withered. The absence of workers devastated agricultural production. Families went hungry. Children begged, terrified they'd also be taken to serve the Queen. But no one dared to complain, because to complain was to disappear. Ranavalona turned labor into punishment, hunger into a tool, poverty into a method of submission. And the more the people bowed, the more she believed her power came from the spirits. But the spirits had already abandoned Madagascar. All that remained was a throne, and a queen alone sitting atop a pile of bones. Over time, fear was no longer enough to maintain control. She needed something more. Ranavalona began to lose herself in the world she had created. What had once been strategy became obsession. What had been discipline turned into madness. She began to ban colors. The color purple was outlawed throughout the kingdom. Whether made from feathers, flowers, or dyes, if it was purple, it had to be burned. No one knew why. Some said she saw signs of witchcraft in the darker shades. Others said it was simply a delusion with no explanation. And it didn't stop there. Peasants were forbidden from whistling at night. Some were punished for laughing too loudly, others for talking in their sleep. A man was beheaded after stumbling in front of the Queen during a ceremony. She saw the accident as a sign of betrayal, but nothing was as disturbing as what she ordered next. Obsessed with death, she commanded that corpses be dug up and put to work. Decomposing bodies were tied to posts along the roads. Others were stuffed and scattered across abandoned farms as if they were still cultivating. The stench spread through entire villages. People fell ill. but no one dared to question it. She also invented what she called races of the condemned. Prisoners were released into open fields and forced to run to a line on the horizon. If they reached it in time, they lived. If they fell, turned their heads, or hesitated, they were killed with spears from behind. Few ever crossed the line. Ranavalona watched from her balconies, commenting on the body's performances like someone judging athletes. She laughed at those who stumbled and applauded those who held out to the end. The palace walls were washed weekly with herbs to ward off invisible presences. Servants slept with balls of earth hidden under their tongues, ready to swallow and suffocate themselves if summoned suddenly. No one rested anymore. No one trusted anymore. No one lived anymore. The entire court had become a prison without bars, and the only cell with a view belonged to the queen herself. Ranavalona was no longer ruling a people. She ruled over ruins, and even the ghosts seemed tired of serving her. When Ranavalona finally died, in August 1861, there were no tears. There was silence. A heavy, wary silence, like that of a people who had waited decades for relief, but weren't sure it was real. They say the first to step into the streets walked slowly, looked to the sky, afraid lightning might strike for daring to celebrate. Others said they heard screams from the palace before her last breath, and that the queen's final words were, "They come with chains of fire, and 1,000 voices are calling me." The funeral ceremony was lavish, but not out of honor, out of fear. Traditional priests performed rituals with special amulets, not to protect the body, but to imprison the soul. Ranavalona was buried far from the previous kings, alone, as she had lived. The throne then passed to her son, Radama II, the same one she had locked away and humiliated for years. And he was the one who tried to erase the bloodstains left by his mother. His first order was clear: abolish Tangina, followed by the release of Christians, the reopening of missionary schools, and the restoration of foreign trade. For the first time in decades, Madagascar could breathe. The people smiled without fear. Letters were once again sent to Europe, and the name Ranavalona began to be avoided, not out of respect, but from trauma. But there was something even the new king couldn't reverse. Terror had become habit. Local leaders still obeyed out of survival instinct. Distrust among neighbors lingered. The culture of denunciation was still alive, and once again, hope didn't last. 18 months later, Radama II was assassinated by members of his own court, strangled with a scarf inside the palace, the same palace where his mother had ordered thousands to die. The coup wasn't about religion, nor foreign politics. It was because the idea of freedom had become unbearable for a people shaped by fear. The blood Ranavalona spilled kept flowing long after her death. She was gone, but her shadow remained. And Madagascar discovered that sometimes the worst legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you plant inside people. Madagascar discovered that sometimes the worst legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you plant inside people. Decades passed, but the name Ranavalona I is still avoided aloud. In the island's oldest regions, mothers still scare their children with tales of the cruel queen who made the sky bleed. On isolated trails, small objects are still left quietly, not as offerings, but as pleas for peace to a spirit that never rested. At the top of the hill in Antananarivo, the palace where she lived, the Rova, still stands. But locals say that place has never been the same. Some call it a monument, others a curse. There are those who say the halls of the Rova do not tolerate laughter. Ranavalona I didn't rule with laws alone. She ruled with fear, with paranoia, with ritualized cruelty. She created a state where death was a spectacle and suspicion a sentence. And even after her death, the country never learned how to live without policing itself. She kept Madagascar from being colonized during her reign. but in doing so, sealed her people's fate with isolation, poverty, and trauma. Almost half the population vanished in 3 decades. Family lines were erased. Entire groups never appeared in censuses again. Millions of lives that never got to exist, all buried beneath a single name. Today, she's remembered not with statues, but with whispers, not with tributes, but with scars. If you made it this far, it's because this story left a mark on you too. So take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, the truth that history tried to bury rises to the surface. And in the next video, get ready to discover another reign, just as real, just as forgotten, where the thirst for power pushed a human being beyond all limits of reason, the reign of Ranavalona. The first may have been the most brutal, but sadly, it wasn't the only one. And the next story will prove it.